Okay, continuing our discussion of the endocrine system, I'm going to introduce the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Now, these are the considered the hypothalamus is considered what's called the master gland because it has control over so much of the endocrine system. And we'll get into all the control systems in a few minutes. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the system. So the hypothalamus actually, so this here is a side-on picture of the view of the brain, and this is a sagittal picture, as if your face would be here if you were able to see your face, but the skull is sort of cut in half. Um, and here, the eyes would be, somewhere around here. And you'd have your ear here. Okay, just to give you a view of where we are. So this dark blue structure here is actually the lateral ventricles of the brain. And I know we just talked about the neural system, and but the brain comes in here as well because of the connection to the hypothalamus. Now this light blue structure here would be the third ventricle. And if you remember, the third ventricle lies in the middle of the brain and drains into the fourth ventricle, which would be down here. Okay, so now why is the third ventricle important? Well, it's because it's actually the floor of the third ventricle that is the hypothalamus. So there's a little bit of neural tissue down here, and that little strip of neural tissue is the hypothalamus. And then hanging below that hypothalamus and connected to it is a pituitary gland. Okay, so that's the location of it. Alright, so let's get a close-up view. I'm going to move up here to a picture that I have of the pituitary gland. Now you can see up here is a collection of nerves. So this here is actually the hypothalamus. And within the hypothalamus there are a number of nerve bodies, some of which extend into the pituitary gland. So we have some, these are the soma of the nerve bodies, and these are the axons. You can't really see that very well, but we have some axons here that extend down into the pituitary gland. Some of them extend down just to the stalk of the pituitary gland, and some extend down all the way. These ones here. Okay, so you can see here that the pituitary gland is roughly divided into two sections, and these sections are called lobes. So we have here the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and we have here the posterior lobe, posterior, and we actually have here in the middle a third lobe that's called the medial lobe, and we're not really going to get into that, but just to be aware that it's there. It's a very small part of the pituitary gland. Okay, so I want to start by talking about the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland has sort of a unique anatomy with a unique vascular supply. Now, you can see here, I'm going to switch to some ink that you can see. You can see here that there are neurons that communicate down into the stalk of the pituitary gland and then stop. And it stops at a capillary bed. Now this capillary bed is fed by an arteriole, as are most capillary beds. But most capillary beds in the body have an arteriole that feeds them, and then they break up into these capillary beds. And then the capillary beds make their way back to a vein. And the vein goes where? It goes back to the heart, right? Particularly the right side of the heart. But, so, in ordinary veins, we'd go back to the heart. But in a couple of places in the body, it doesn't go back to the heart. It actually opens back up into a second capillary bed. Okay. Now that happens, as far as I'm aware, this only happens in two places in the body. It happens in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and it happens in the liver. Now, so we have a first capillary bed and a second capillary bed. Actually, I think it happens in the kidneys as well, but it's a little bit of a different situation in the kidneys. So we have we have two capillary beds here. And when you have two capillary beds that are separated by a vein carrying the blood between them, this vein is called a portal vein. So that's the exact structure that we have here. We have an arteriole that's feeding the anterior section of the stalk of the pituitary gland, and then actually I think this should be blue in my mind, so I'm going to change it. We have a portal vein. And why do we have a portal vein here? Well, because we open back up into a second capillary bed. Why do we need a second capillary bed? Well, that is because it is the way that the anterior pituitary communicates with the hypothalamus. So what we have here is the hypothalamus is actually releasing hormones in right next to this capillary bed, and the capillary bed is absorbing them. And particularly, it's releasing what are called releasing hormones. And these releasing hormones are things like thyrotropin and gonadotropin releasing hormone and corticotropin releasing hormone. So these are hormones that direct the pituitary to release other hormones. Okay, so these releasing hormones come from the axons from the hypothalamus and are released into this capillary bed, and then they travel through this portal vein down into the pituitary, where they move out from the capillary bed into the anterior pituitary cells, where they signal the anterior pituitary to release specific hormones in response. So what hormones do we have in the anterior pituitary? We have all sorts of stimulating hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands to release their hormones. So here we have stimulating hormones. And examples of this would be thyroid stimulating hormone. And the role of thyroid stimulating hormone is to tell the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone, right? And then similarly, there is adrenocorticotropic hormones that stimulate the cortex of the adrenal glands to release cortisol, and it communicates with follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to the testes and the ovaries to release testosterone and estrogen, right? Okay, and etc. And you can, I know the book has a lot of details about exactly which hormones, so I'm not going to go into every single hormone, but this just gives you an example of how this occurs. So again, just to go through it again step by step, we have the hypothalamus sending neuropeptides. So these are actually neurotransmitters that move down the axon. Actually, they don't move down, but we have an action potential in the hypothalamus that sends information down the axon to release a a neurotransmitter or neuroendocrine hormone, and the neuroendocrine hormone is a releasing hormone like thyrotropin, and that is released and absorbed into the capillaries. It moves down the portal vein into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, where it exits the capillaries and moves into cells within the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and those cells are signaled to release another hormone. So again, if it was thyrotropin that was released, the thyrotropin is communicating with cells in the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. So now thyroid stimulating hormone is released again and is absorbed by this capillary bed, and it comes through the vein back into the body and circulates through the body until it gets to the thyroid gland. And when it reaches the thyroid gland, it tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay, so that's how the process occurs in the anterior pituitary. Okay, now I know everybody here in prior classes has probably heard of the hypothalamic pituitary axis, or HPA axis. Now I just wanted to talk a little bit, just review it quickly. Now the HPA axis is essentially a negative feedback loop. Okay, so what happens here is there is a steady state, but then something changes, and the hypothalamus, right now we're using an example of luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone, and luteinizing hormone and estrogen in a woman's body. Okay, so but this system is the exact same negative feedback system that controls all hormone systems in the HPA axis. So what happens is the body decides that it needs more luteinizing hormone. It communicates through the thalamus, through the hypothalamus, to send information to the pituitary gland, and it does this by, again, releasing a neurotransmitter that functions as a neuroendocrine hormone called luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone. And this is released into that capillary bed inside the stalk of the pituitary gland, and that travels down the portal vein, should make that portal vein blue, in to the capillary loop, and is secreted into the pituitary gland, and is picked up by the cells there, and the cells are stimulated by the luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone to secrete luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so they are going to secrete these things, and these things are going to be picked up in the ovaries and stimulate cells in the ovaries to produce estrogen. Okay, we're not going to worry about progesterone, we're just going to worry about estrogen. Now, what happens in the body is there's actually two loops here. The estrogen, the presence of, we're going to have an increased amount of estrogen. Now, the increased amount of estrogen is going to be pumped into the bloodstream, and it's going to flow through the capillary system in the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to tell the anterior pituitary gland to produce less luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, and at the same time, the estrogen, as it's traveling through the bloodstream, is also going to travel through the hypothalamus. Now remember, in one of my previous videos I talked about the hypothalamus is one of the only areas of the brain that does not have a blood-brain barrier. So, and one of the reasons why is because it has to be constantly aware of all the hormone levels inside the body, and some hormones cannot cross through the blood-brain barrier, except it can cross through into the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus detects this higher level of estrogen, and it has a negative, it provides negative feedback and tells the hypothalamus to produce less luteinizing hormone. Okay, so it has a sort of double feedback loop, a short feedback loop goes right from the ovaries to the pituitary gland, and a longer feedback loop that goes from the ovaries all the way up to the hypothalamus, and both are causing a reduced production of these hormones, which will eventually tell the ovaries to slow down their production of estrogen, and that will just prevent the body from overproducing estrogen. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is very different from the anterior lobe, both in anatomy and in function. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is, in a way, an extension of the hypothalamus itself. The hormones are actually created in the nerve soma of the hypothalamus, because these are neuropeptides, and they work their way down the stalk, where they're stored in the bouton of these long axons, and released into the posterior pituitary. And these are the hormones themselves. These neuropeptides are the hormones. And the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland are ADH and oxytocin. Now, interestingly enough, these hormones actually have a very similar chemical structure, so they almost sort of cross-react with each other. Sometimes ADH can actually stimulate oxytocin receptors, and vice versa, although the cross-reactivity is relatively low. Okay, so what do these hormones do? Well, let's talk about ADH first. So again, ADH is a neuropeptide that is released from the axon bouton and into the capillaries of the posterior pituitary, and from there into the general circulation. Okay, so ADH. What does ADH do? Well, the receptors of ADH are in the kidneys. For some reason, kidneys are always supposed to be orange. Now, inside the kidneys, we have a glomerulus, and we're going to talk about how the glomerulus works, but let's kind of expand our view here and create a little glomerulus. And this is supposed to be Bowman's capsule, and it drains into the collecting ducts. And then, the collecting ducts are these sort of tortuous things. And then we have the loop of Henle, and actually, sorry about that. I called these are actually the proximal convoluted ducts, and then because from the loop of Henle they drain into the collecting ducts. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole process here, but essentially what happens with urine is the hairpin turn of the loop of Henle actually functions, the entire loop of Henle actually functions to provide a really, really high concentration of solutes in this area of the kidney. And the osmolarity of this area is like 1500. The osmolarity of blood, on the other hand, is around 300. So we have a huge concentration of solutes, primarily sodium. So we have this huge concentration gradient from the collecting ducts back into this area. All right. So water wants to travel from these collecting ducts back into the tissues around the glomerulus. But it generally doesn't, because there are no all the water channels here are closed. Remember, there's water pores. Here, let me draw that in a different color. Everywhere in the body there are pores where water can flow freely from one membrane to another across cell membranes. But in the case of the collecting ducts, these water pores are closed. So when these water pores are closed, we actually have very dilute urine going down to the bladder and getting peed out. Okay, so there's the bladder. But ADH works by signaling these water pores to open up. So it opens them up, and then water gets sucked down the concentration gradient into this really highly into this area that has a very, very high osmolality. So this can concentrate the urine to an osmolality of near 1500, right? So through osmosis, free water gets pulled through these open pores with the signaling of ADH back into this highly concentrated area near the hairpin turn of the loop of Henle, and then the urine will become very, very concentrated, and not very much water will make it down to the bladder. Okay, so it conserves water, and this water ends up going back into the bloodstream and back into systemic circulation. So that is why antidiuretic hormone has an antidiuretic effect, because it sucks the water back into the systemic circulation and makes very concentrated urine. Okay. Now, just a little anecdote. Those of you who have imbibed alcohol from time to time, it's interesting to note, I'm sure that everybody has noticed that when you drink alcohol, you tend to urinate a lot. And the reason for that is, remember, alcohol generally works as an inhibitor in the brain, and alcohol actually, remember the chemical symbol for alcohol is ETO, or ethyl alcohol. It actually works as an inhibitor for these neurons. So these neurons are inhibited, and it stops them from producing, actually it stops them from producing both ADH and oxytocin. That's one reason if there's a woman that's having difficulty breastfeeding, it's probably a good idea to encourage them not to drink alcohol, because you're also going to suppress the production and secretion of oxytocin as well. But drinking alcohol decreases the production and secretion of antidiuretic hormone by this inhibitory effect in the hypothalamus. So what happens is you have less antidiuretic hormone, these pores remain closed, so you dump a lot of undiluted urine, or lots of free water into the bladder, and then after finishing your second bottle of wine, actually I shouldn't say bottle, if your second glass of wine, and you're rushing off to the bathroom to empty your bladder, and that is why, because you've inhibited the secretion of your antidiuretic hormone. Now, oxytocin actually communicates with tissue in the breast. And they're actually inside the breast tissue. There are myoepithelial cells, and it stimulates these cells to let down milk during breastfeeding. And it also stimulates the uterus itself to stimulate strong contractions. And those of you who have worked in OB know that Pitocin, which is essentially synthetic oxytocin, is actually given sometimes to stimulate stronger contractions in the uterus. And also, women that have significant bleeding after giving birth are oftentimes encouraged to breastfeed their baby, because it'll actually increase the strength of contractions in the uterus, and that extra strength of contraction may help to sort of tampen out the bleed, so the bleeding doesn't continue.